Good evening. Dear Professor Rogers, dear Lautenschläger family, dear guests and colleagues, as the Vice Rector of Heidelberg University, it's my privilege to welcome you all. Tonight, we will bestow the James W.C. Pennington Award 2023 in the name of Heidelberg's Faculty of Theology and the Heidelberg Center of American Studies. The prize goes to Professor Melvin Rogers from Brown University. It's wonderful to have you here, and I hope you have been enjoying your stay in Heidelberg so far and you will continue to have a pleasant time. Endowed by the Manfred Lautenschläger Foundation, the award came into being in 2011, the year of the 625th anniversary of the Ruperto Carola. Since then, the Pennington Award has developed into an internationally recognized scholarly prize. It marks a distinguished feature of our academic life here in Heidelberg, of which we are very proud. Over the past 12 years, the award brought a group of extraordinary scholars to Heidelberg. All of them come from prestigious universities and are leading scholars in their respective fields. With the lectures and the classes they taught here at the HCA, the award winners greatly enriched the intellectual life of our university. Students from various disciplines affiliated with the HCA had an opportunity to engage with the recipients of the award and benefited from this academic but as well personal exchange. The classes, all Lautenschläger Fellows, the award winners, teach, highlight Heidelberg's emphasis on high standards of teaching and research-oriented teaching in particular. In my understanding, the award honors the same ideals that the university as a whole embraces: intellectual courage and excellence, as well as the belief in the power of education and knowledge, not only as a means towards scientific advancement, but also as a way to open our minds and hearts to people around the world and to an appreciation of their histories and cultural traditions. Moreover, the Pennington Award and the fellowship attached to it fits very well into the academic profile of Ruperto Carola. The award grew out of and is sustained by a collaboration of the university's oldest faculty, the Faculty of Theology, with one of its youngest and most interdisciplinary research institutions, namely the Heidelberg Center for American Studies. In this, it is a very suitable representation of our university's more general goal of combining a drive for innovation and future skills with a strong commitment to a long tradition, reaching back all the way to 1386. The Pennington Award stands also for the international orientation of our university and more specifically for the importance of our strong and long-standing ties to many partner institutions in the United States, ties of friendship that are very important given the current international situation. Today, universities increasingly reach outside their institutional boundaries to engage in cooperations with private partners. In this regard, too, the Pennington Award is exemplary, as it was very generously endowed by the Lautenschläger Foundation, a long-standing and strong supporter of Heidelberg University and the HCA in particular. So this gives me the occasion to also express my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Lautenschläger and his family on behalf of the Ruperto Carola. This award is certainly a great gift to our university and its academic community. And now again, a very warm welcome to you, Professor Rogers, and I don't want to take more of your time. I will leave the floor now. Thank you very much.
Dear Professor Rogers, dear Vice President Professor Sens, ladies and gentlemen, My name is Katharina Segelken, and on behalf of the Manfred Lautenschläger Foundation, I would like to welcome you to tonight's lecture and the ceremony in which we will bestow the Pennington Award for the 11th time. My father decided to fund this award in 2011 because the story of Pennington's life and achievements as an anti-slavery reformer deeply impressed him, and because he was fascinated by the connection with his alma mater, the Heidelberg University. In 1849, Heidelberg's Faculty of Theology gave an honorary doctorate in divinity to the African-American minister and runaway slave, also as a way to support the cause of abolition. Over the years that my brother and I have been attending these lectures and talking to the award winners, we have learned a great deal about this remarkable man, his life, times, and works. This deepened our feeling even more that Pennington and his achievements in the fight for freedom and human dignity are well worth remembering, and his writings and ideas are highly relevant still for today. The award pays tribute to Pennington by honoring scholars who have done distinguished work on topics important to Pennington: slavery, emancipation, peace, education, reform, civil rights, religion, and intercultural understanding. Since its inception in 2011, the award has brought a series of very distinguished scholars from prestigious universities to Heidelberg. Looking back over these 12 years, I can say with full conviction that my father's idea bore great fruits. In more than one way, the Pennington Award has been a great success. In our understanding, the award stands for the values and ideals that informed Pennington's extraordinary life and work. These are also values and ideals that the Foundation holds to be central and that are reflected in many of the projects we support. First and foremost, the furthering of education and scholarship as a means of individual and social progress, the advocacy for human rights and human dignity for people everywhere, practical help for those who are less privileged, and the promotion of mutual understanding and peaceful dialogue between cultures, races, and religions. At the same time, we are convinced that the scholars honored with this award will help an international audience to think about the wider meaning of African American history, culture, and religion, the legacy of slavery, the persistent problem of racism, and the Black freedom struggle. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." So the Black freedom struggle matters to us here. It matters all the more because our own society, while different from the United States, has its own legacy of racial hatred and violence to deal with. We have a lot to learn from each other in how to confront these dark histories and how to move forward with creating more just and inclusive forms of democracy. So I'm eagerly looking forward to tonight's lecture, and I thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming, first of all. And as Dean of the Faculty of Theology, it is my privilege now to introduce to you the winner of the Pennington Award 2023, Professor Melvin Rogers, who is a professor of political science at Brown University, Rhode Island, where he also serves as the associate director of the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Professor Rogers is one of the foremost authorities on the tradition of African American political thought, a field which obviously is of central importance to understanding Pennington as well. We therefore consider him a perfect candidate for the award, and I might add, we are very happy to honor for the first time in the history of the award a scholar from political science. Over the more than 10 years that the award has been in existence, we had colleagues from a wide range of disciplines, religious history, literary history, but never a political scientist. Professor Rogers made that step easy for us, I have to say, because he represents a kind of political science that unfortunately has become rare in Germany. close to the humanities, interested in political theories and ideas from a historical perspective. So I found conversations with him in the classroom so enriching and enlightening. Let me just say personally, I'm very glad you're here, Melvin, and hearty welcome from me as well. Professor Rogers received his undergraduate education from Amherst College and did his graduate work at Yale University, with considerable time spent as an exchange student at Princeton's Department of Religion, leading to the PhD in political science in 2006. And at Princeton, he crossed paths with an old friend of ours and the award Eddie Glaude, who also kindled his interest in the American pragmatist tradition and the African-American religious tradition. After that, Professor Rogers was assistant professor first at the University of Virginia and then at Emory University in Atlanta, before becoming the Scott Wall Associate Professor of Political Science and African-American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles in 2014, and then in 2017 he moved to Brown, his present academic home. He has two main academic fields of interest. On the one hand, political theory and theory of democracy, especially as viewed through the American pragmatist tradition, and secondly, African-American political thought. So let me comment on his work in political theory and pragmatism first. Professor Rogers' first book, The Undiscovered Dewey, Religion, Morality, and the Ethos of Democracy, published with Columbia University Press in 2008, can be said in many ways to have been an unlikely and daring book to launch a career, whose critical interventions, however, were all the more rewarding. Why was it daring? John Dewey, of course, was the towering figure of the pragmatist tradition in the early 20th century and perhaps the most influential public intellectual and theoretician of American democracy before World War II. After the war, however, Dewey's star began to decline and his thinking has been attacked from different quarters. Among other things, Dewey was criticized for having been far too optimistic, even naive in his anthropology and his epistemology, and for paying too little attention to the kind of ethno-racial and religious divisions we face today in our modern societies. Now, Melvin Rogers, in this book, offers a revisionist reading of Dewey to recover what he considers lost intellectual and moral resources for revitalized politics in our modern pluralistic societies. The Undiscovered Dewey explores the profound influence of evolution and its corresponding ideas of contingency and uncertainty on Dewey's philosophy of action, particularly its argument that inquiry proceeds from the uncertainty of human activity. According to Rogers, Dewey launched a new understanding of the modern self that encouraged intervention in social and natural environments, but which nonetheless demanded courage and humility because of the intimate relationship between action and uncertainty. And Rogers convincingly demonstrates that, contrary to common belief, Dewey sought a place for religious commitment within a democratic society sensitive to modern pluralism. Now, a further part in his effort to recover Dewey was a volume edited by Professor Rogers titled John Dewey, The Public and Its Problem. It came out with Ohio University Press in 2016. And Professor Rogers has written multiple essays and chapters in prestigious venues on Dewey, the pragmatist tradition more generally, and how to recover it for today, including, I'll just cite one title here, a special issue he edited for the journal Contemporary Pragmatism in 2010 on the topic of revisiting the public and its problems. Of course, his interests in political theory are not limited to the American pragmatist tradition. He has, among many other things, also engaged with the Frankfurt School. I just want to mention that here. In an essay titled Rereading Axel Honneth, Exodus, Politics, and the Paradox of Recognition, published with the European Journal of Political Theory. Now let me turn to the second major field of interest to which he has contributed significant work. That is African American political thought. Here I want to mention a hefty volume he co-edited with Jack Turner on the African American political thought, a collected history, published with the University of Chicago Press in 2021. It's an anthology of 30 essays on figures in the tradition of African American political thought from the early 19th century all the way to the present. And this shows, I think, Professor Rogers' approach to African American political thought as not confined to academic writers who explicitly wrote on this subject. If you want to get to political theorizing in black, as he likes to put it, you need to consider a wide range of figures, from abolitionists such as Pennington to literary writers of our own period. This is also reflected in the Oxford University Press's New Histories of Philosophy series that he's co-editing, and he makes an attempt to also introduce Afrikaner thinkers, broadly understood in this way, to the realm of political philosophy, including a volume on Pennington that we are preparing. In his own research, he's been particularly interested in the 19th and early 20th century, bookended by the radical black anti-slavery activist David Walker, early 19th century, and the pioneering analyst of African American life behind the veil of segregation that is W.E.B. Du Bois. To these two, he has turned repeatedly in a series of essays, and I just want to cite two examples here. One, David Walker and the Political Power of the Appeal, published in Political Theory in 2015, or The People, Rhetoric, and Affect on the Political Force of Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, published in American Political Science Review in 2012. And these inquiries have now culminated in a second major monographical study, The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought, which is forthcoming this fall from Princeton University Press. And we had the privilege in the class to get a sneak preview of one of the chapters. The book examines what resources are provided by the African American political tradition to help with revitalizing and redirecting American democracy to ensure its survival. For African American activists, intellectuals, and artists who have sought to transform the United States into a racially just society, have put forward some of the most original and powerful ideas about how to make America live up to its democratic ideals. The Darkened Light of Faith examines how figures from Walker to Du Bois, and more recently, James Baldwin, thought about the politics, people, character, and culture of a society that so often dominated them. Although, having had every reason to despair of American democracy, they resisted that conclusion. They resisted the conclusion that America would always be committed to white supremacy. They believed that democracy is always in the process of becoming, you hear the pragmatist here, and that they could use it to reimagine society. But they also saw that achieving racial justice wouldn't absolve Americans of the darkest features of their shared past, and that democracy must be measured by how skillfully we confront this history that will never go away. And herein also lies an interesting lesson for German democracy, I think. I hope you all agree with me that we couldn't have asked for a more worthy candidate for the 2023 Pennington Award. And let me say I'm greatly looking forward to your lecture later on, Melvin, Republicanism in Black, 19th Century African American Contributions to Our Idea of Freedom. But before we go there, we would ask you on stage to receive the Pennington Award.
Rogers. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think they are all curious for your lecture.
Thank you very much. Whew. Pretty extraordinary. Wow, I've been here for a week and I've just been enjoying Heidelberg. I've been enjoying the students, and I'm not gonna get emotional about this, but I'm quite honored. I'm quite honored, and I'm also honored to have the opportunity, and one should not understate it, of being able to speak in one's own native tongue. So thank you for that as well. I would like to thank Jan for facilitating this. I would like to thank the Heidelberg Center for American Studies, and I would like to thank the Lautenschläger family for seeing in James Pennington and the wider tradition he represents as something worth investing in and caring about. So thank you very much. And I should thank all of the invisible labor that make these events possible. So thank you very much. All right, so let's get to it. All right. So today I will take up the broad tradition of Black republicanism in the 19th century. And now let me just say what occasioned my reflections, why I selected this talk. What occasioned my reflections were two claims, one from the extraordinary historian of political thought, Quentin Skinner, and the other from a contemporary political philosopher, also extraordinary, Philip Pettit. And so here now are the relevant passages that occasion these reflections. Quote, with the rise of classical utilitarianism in the 18th century, Skinner writes, the idea of republicanism eventually slipped almost wholly out of sight. Now, without proper clarification, this claim seems to be part of a story about the fate of republicanism in the modern period, both in Europe and North America. The point, I think, is more forcefully stated by the political philosopher Philip Pettit as he reflects on the ascendancy of the political philosophical tradition of liberalism. And this is what he writes. Listen to this one. Not only did the conception of freedom as non-interference displace the Republican idea in the new liberal tradition, it apparently succeeded without anyone noticing, end quote. Now, I take these statements to be quite unfortunate, largely because they're mistaken. And I say these statements are mistaken because surely when we attend to the ongoing problem of slavery in the United States in the 19th century, we shall find the language of republicanism very much alive. And this is not to say anything about those that sought in the same century to resist colonialism and patriarchy, who also drew on the tradition of republicanism. I don't know why Skinner and Pettit speak this way, but it does strike me that the moment we expand our narratives of the past, the moment we look beyond those figures that typically enjoy philosophical standing, we will find that the tradition of republicanism is not only alive in the 19th century, but is undergoing conceptual reconfiguration by African Americans. So there it is. That's the claim I want to defend today. That republicanism is very much alive in the 19th century and undergoing conceptual reconfiguration by African Americans. So what does that mean? So early African American political thought and activism draws on two strands of the tradition of republicanism. The first strand focuses on the importance of character and virtue to a healthy political society. Black thinkers in the early 19th century see exclusion as rooted in the motivation and attitudes of the citizens. They think the sort of attitude of exclusion frames and informs the character of the citizenry. And they think that character is quite important because it helps to shape and inform the laws of political society. African Americans focus on the ethos or culture of the American polity, treating laws and institutions as important, but nonetheless derivations from the characterological propensities of the nation. Republicanism in this form, I think it's sort of powerfully captured in the classical period by someone like Aristotle. Republicanism in this form emphasizes ideas of civic virtue, political participation, and it sees character as central to a self-determining, self-governing polity. Now, the second strand is expressed through African Americans' desire to resist and escape practices of domination in the United States. Republicanism, in this form, as many have argued, tell us that to be unfree is to be under the dominion of another. That is, to live under the arbitrary will of another, which is to say, to be unfree is to be a slave. This iteration of republicanism finds its roots in classical Rome, is rearticulated by Machiavelli during the Renaissance, and is defended by thinkers in the modern period, such as James Harrington, Montesquieu, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. And for this strand, the security of freedom depends on a republic imposing constitutional constraints that guard against the use of arbitrary power, and providing institutional spaces that allow citizens to contest what they perceive to be as an illegitimate use of power. The two strands that I just mentioned are connected now in the following way. The characterological orientation of the first, this emphasis on character and civic virtue, helps to realize and stabilize the institutional meaning of freedom found in the second account. So how then do African American intellectuals touch, add to, and redeploy, reconfigure this tradition? Well, from the 1830s to the 1850s, thinkers such as David Walker, Moriah Stewart, Hosea Easton, James Pennington, Martin Delany, and Frederick Douglass, all black and all abolitionists, reconfigure civic virtue under conditions of racial solidarity. Reconfigure civic virtue under conditions of racial domination. Civic virtue, and here is the point, is not merely about good participation in political society. Rather, civic virtue is about being in proper fellowship with those experiencing and resisting domination. Now, even among them, as they subscribed to this view, even among them, they had disagreements about how to understand this idea of fellowship and what really is involved and what follows from it. And you get weaker and stronger versions of this, where some see racial solidarity as a temporary position on the road to reimagining a more inclusive American society. Others understand racial solidarity as a permanent and necessary condition. Someone like Martin Delany, a 19th century black nationalist, argues that black people should immigrate because the likelihood, or let me say it differently, they will be unlikely to transform the United States. But it's not just civic virtue that has transformed. Republicanism's commitment to freedom against domination is also complicated when it confronts racial domination, when it confronts chattel slavery. All of these thinkers are worried about slavery, but the meaning of slavery, a master who exercises power at his or her whim, extends beyond the formal practices of enslavement. Here, slavery is reached as dispersed through the culture of American life, circumscribing Black Americans even in instances where there is no obvious master. Frederick Douglass, I think, succinctly and powerfully captures the point in an 1848 speech. And this is what he says, quote, "In northern states, we are not slaves to individuals, not personal slaves, yet in many respects, we are the slaves of the community." And the reason why, as James Pennington explains in 1849, is because Black and white relationships are structured by what Pennington calls the chattel principle. For Douglass and Pennington, to enjoy freedom, to enjoy liberty, does not merely involve being free from the arbitrary mercy of a particular agent or having laws that would limit forms of arbitrary power. Being free involves transforming the cultural system of valuation in which Blacks occupy a lower position of worth. And this could not be achieved by merely tracking institutional domination, but by also attending to its racialized form that generates bad political and ethical habits. And one important implication is that freedom requires that Black Americans be seen or taken in a certain way by their fellows. They must be regarded as equals. And being seen or taken in a certain way must extend beyond formal positive laws, the laws we construct. The contemporary view, for example, that you find in Pettit, the view in which republicanism is identified with satisfying a range of constitutional constraints, and the view that links domination to the presence of what he calls a dominus or a master, will ultimately obscure the levels of concern that we find in African American political thought and practice, both then and, dare I say, now. By focusing on constitutionalism and positive law, Pettit specifically, but much of the tradition of republicanism generally, fails to understand the nature of racial domination where African Americans are concerned. In other words, racial domination is not about political standing that is now in doubt or denied, as was traditionally understood, that could be rectified by putting the proper laws on the books, or rectified by including the right constitutional constraints. Racial domination significantly is tied to a belief that one was never fit for freedom in the first place. So focusing on this issue, I think, explains the concern Black Americans have with transforming the cultural logic of American life. This is how you avoid, as Douglass says, being the slave of the community. So let me try to say a little bit more with a little bit of textual support how we get these two different transformations and what they amount to. The first being civic virtue transformed into racial solidarity and the differences among African Americans, and then the next bit on freedom. So we begin with David Walker's incendiary pamphlet of 1829, Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. Published in Boston, the pamphlet traveled along the eastern seaboard through a loose interracial network, emboldening some and, of course, sparking the indignation of others. It traveled well into the state of Georgia and as far west as Louisiana. And on the one hand, the pamphlet marks the end of earlier deferential appeals by African Americans, and on the other, it set in motion forceful criticisms by African Americans of slavery and domination that would subsequently become the hallmark of the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement. Walker's appeal confronts the reader with the tragic details of being Black in the United States, and it confronts the reader with the uncertainty of Black life in the United States. Any man, writes Walker in Article 2 of his 4-article appeal, any man, and here I quote him now, who is curious to see the full force of ignorance developed among the colored people of the United States of America has only to go into the southern and western states of the Confederacy, where, if he is not a tyrant, but has the feelings of a human who can feel for a fellow creature, he may see enough to make his very heart bleed. The invocation of sentiment, captured metaphorically in the bleeding heart, should not be separated from the theme of character. Walker participates in the wider intellectual culture of the period, the wider intellectual culture of sentimental appeals that was central to early American moral, religious, and political thinking. And in the passage that I just provided you, Walker tells you that to be a human being means you have the capacity and are often inclined to feel for your fellows. And he uses this description of being human to properly orient his readers to the daily treatment of black people. And one of the things that must be said is that many African Americans in the 19th century, although not just them, often thought of public sentiment and the character of the public together. So, for example, Hosea Easton, a minister and friend of David Walker, remarks in his very extended 1837 treatise, quote, "A government like this is at any time liable to be revolutionized by the people at any and every time there is a change in public sentiment. This, perhaps," he continues, "is as it should be." And the point here is the following. Cultivate the proper public sentiment toward the harm of black people, and you will in turn produce a just society in which all can share. That was the thought. The emphasis on character and public sentiment is not new in the history of political thought, even if it takes on a different articulation in African American political thought, in figures like Walker and Easton. But it finds some of its most important expressions among classical Republican thinkers, such as Aristotle and Cicero, and is reaffirmed by the American thinkers, such as Adams and Jefferson. But I think we are likely to miss the difference between African Americans and these more traditionally recognized thinkers and activists if we conclude here. And why is that? Well, thinkers such as Thomas Jefferson emphasize character and public sentiment to affirm and stabilize a political society that is largely seen as white and largely seen as male. In contrast, black intellectuals deploy character talk to highlight the fracture, the divide at the core of American society. The themes of character and public sentiment are connected to the idea of the common good that was quite central to the discourse of republicanism. For Aristotle, Cicero, and many of the American founders, the stability of political society depends on proper attentiveness. You must focus on the common, the shared good. And they all interpret civic virtue as a form of attentiveness that helps to integrate the community. Citizens must, as Cicero writes in On Duties, quote, "fix their gaze so firmly on what is beneficial to citizens and care," here it is, "for the whole body of the republic, rather than protect one part and neglect the rest." So what then is one to do in the face of the differential application of care and concern in the United States? Everyone's not being cared for. How does one act when one part of society is protected, as Cicero worried, and the other is neglected? These are the questions of Walker and Easton and forms the basis of their republicanism. In answering these questions, they focus our attention on the conditions of internal slavery and the absence of mutual recognition. You are not recognized by the society as a member, and therefore you do not enjoy the freedom properly accorded those formerly recognized. And in that case, civic virtue is not about attentiveness and participation in the whole of the body politic. Rather, civic virtue becomes a cooperative performance among those who are excluded to respond to their unfreedom. Civic virtue becomes solidarity, and its rationale is derived from the very thing that is the source of one's exclusion in the first place, race. Civic virtue becomes racial solidarity. Okay, but how precisely do they understand this idea of racial solidarity? And what does it really amount to? How is the concept of race being used here? Well, to answer these questions, we need to first get clear very briefly about the functioning of racial classification. Briefly, racial classification takes the form of assigning meaning to what the philosopher Paul Taylor refers to as human bodies and bloodlines that permit one to draw inferences about more distant, often non-physical matters. Reason, your ability to reason, your moral agency, your capacity to imagine. The meaning of one's racial classification in the 18th and 19th centuries functions as a global category. And here is the thing to remember. It allows one to make judgments about particular individuals that fall under the classification or fall under the category. As Thomas Jefferson, for example, argues in Notes on the State of Virginia of 1787, especially Query 14, and this is Jefferson, regardless of the biological source of one's blackness, its meaning is of importance for understanding the capacities of African Americans. And although Jefferson advances it as, to quote him, a suspicion, end quote, no one doubted the force of his claim that, quote, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments of body and mind, end quote. Now, on this view, black people literally become interchangeable no matter where they live in the country. Hence, Walker says to Northern readers, if any of you, and this is Walker, if any of you wish to know how free you are, let one of you start and go through the southern and western states of this country. And unless you have your free papers, which if you're not careful, they'll get from you, they will sell you into eternal slavery, end quote. And this is because, once again, it is the presumed universalism of the category of race that defines the proper status of African Americans, of black people, as unfree. And it is the presumed interchangeability of black people in the eyes of white Americans that also fuels the defense of solidarity. You see this in Walker and Easton, the two thinkers I have focused on, but you also see this in Maria Stewart, the Boston abolitionist writing in the 1830s. You see it in the minister, Henry Highland Garnett, and the extraordinary activism of Frederick Douglass in the 1840s. Coordinated effort with other blacks to resist domination and transform the system responsible for it is necessary to generate and sustain a successful black community. And solidarity, and I think this is a crucial point, solidarity is an outgrowth. It is an outgrowth or response to racial categorization. But even still, Walker and Easton only offer us a weak form of racial solidarity. Walker and Easton's arguments endorse racial solidarity as the initial move toward a more inclusive society. And this means that they hold out the possibility of ethical and political transformation, and they seek to awaken their white counterparts. In this, they are not yet committed to the proposition that white Americans are beyond transformation, or that the habit of civility by blacks and the practices of domination by whites fully exhaust the meaning or culture of American society. And precisely because they do not subscribe to the idea that white supremacy has fully captured the character of the nation, racial solidarity in this form really only expresses itself as a kind of nascent form of group unity that envisions a society ultimately in which we all can enjoy freedom and equality. Of course, this is a position from which someone like Martin Delany would quickly depart. And this will point to a significant difference between some of these figures, the ones that I have focused on, and the figure of Martin Delany. So let me turn now to that figure, Martin Delany, perhaps the first defender of a theory of black nationalism. And Delaney follows the logic of solidarity to what he takes to be its natural conclusion, which is his defense of immigration. And he follows it to what he perceives to be his natural conclusion, given what he claims to be the fixed character of racial domination. That's quite important to remember. Now, I'm less interested in his theory of black nationalism and more interested in how he understands American society and his white counterparts, such that it justifies black nationalism and ultimately the defense of immigration. So in his signature political philosophical text, The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, published in April of 1852, we get this powerful indictment of the United States. The transformation of the racial context in the United States by the 1850s was, if you can believe, far darker than it appeared in 1829. It directly affected his fellow African Americans in the form of the Draconian Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, an act that strengthened the earlier 1793 version. Emerging out of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act required that captured slaves who nonetheless found their way to free states were to be returned to their presumptive masters. Delaney's text addresses the compromise in the fugitive slave law, prompting him to argue for immigration. Now, Delaney's interest in the fugitive slave law brings, I think, into sharp focus his sophisticated understanding, his sophisticated analysis of the relationship between law and political society, law and culture. The law does not reveal a society that has betrayed itself, as suggested by Walker and Easton, but a social and political community that fundamentally denies the dignity of black Americans. This much Delaney says, marking a difference between himself and the earlier figures. Listen to what he says here. It's quite striking. Quote, "We are politically not of them, but aliens to the laws and political privileges of the country. These are truths, fixed facts that quaint theory and exhausted moralizing fall harmlessly before." He focuses on the fugitive slave law because he takes the idea of positive law, the laws we construct, to express the underlying culture of the society to which he belongs. And his analysis turns on a distinction he makes in the early part of that book. There he says, in that early part, that the moral law, the place where one's sense and feeling of right and justice lies, and here it is to be distinguished from positive law or the law of the political state. In the case of the United States, the positive law is the result of a cooperative enterprise, and the moral law need not necessarily determine and guide the construction of positive law. It is very possible for the polity to voluntarily construct laws that express their underlying commitments and to be legitimate to that extent, even as those laws swing free of right and justice. Now, of course, this is a view that someone like Walker or Pennington or Douglas, they would not have recognized this view. They would have disagreed intensely with this view. This is how Delaney puts it. This is the law of the land. He's referring to the Fugitive Slave Act. This is the law of the land. And to suppose its repeal is to anticipate an overthrow of the Confederative Union. Well, why? It might just simply be a change of law. And candidly, we believe, he continues, the existence of the Fugitive Slave Law necessary to the continuance of the National Compact. Certainly, we will not be understood as meaning that the enactment of such a law was really necessary, or as favoring in the least this political monstrosity. Here it is. But we speak logically and politically, leaving morality and right out of the question, taking our position on the acknowledged popular basis of American policy. It's extraordinary. The law crystallizes, for Delaney, the background attitudinal orientation of the society. But it is an orientation that stands apart from questions such as, is this right or is this just? I mean, notice what Delaney is doing. I mean, it's quite dramatic. For him, there is a difference between the source or origin from which law issues and its content. So that means that procedurally, if a law emerges from the polity's decision procedure, let's say majority rule, if a law emerges from majority rule, it's legitimate to that extent. Legitimacy, as he sees it, is about the proper relationship between the physical law and those on whose behalf the law is issued and over whom, as determined by the Constitution. He thus connects the political foundations of American society to its largely white male voting population, and he then uses the outcome of their decisions as communicating who the citizenry is and in what their true commitments consist. And in a Republican polity, he argues, the only political actors that matter are those recognized by the Constitution. And since that is the white property portion of the population, he concludes, quote, a people capable of originating and sustaining such a law as this, the fugitive slave law, are not the people to whom we are willing to entrust our liberty at discretion. In a famous address that he gives in 1854, Delaney explains the radical transformation that would need to happen to change the status of Black Americans. And this is what he writes. In the United States, among the whites, their color is made by law and custom, the mark of distinction and superiority. While the color of the blacks is a badge of degradation acknowledged by statute, organic law, and the common consent of the people. With this view of the case, to elevate to equality the degraded subject of law and custom, it can only be done by an entire destruction of the identity of the former condition of the applicant. And what does this mean? So by identity here, Delaney has in mind the identity that is ascribed, that is attached to African Americans by virtue of their race, what he calls the badge of degradation that is instantiated in the political, legal, and cultural life of America. The identity of white Americans partly comes about, or so Delaney suggests, by virtue of their contrast with their darker counterparts. To overcome this condition requires that one destroy the badge of degradation, yes, but this also involves significantly a willingness by white Americans to destroy the legal and customary badge of superiority they now flaunt. And this Delaney doubts. The enormity of the problem shapes his account of solidarity. And we now see, I think, a very big difference between Delaney on the one hand and the earlier figures I mentioned. The problem requires not only cooperation among blacks to resist domination, well, that was the argument of Walker and Easton, but a more significant form of racial unity that eventuates in the founding of an independent state. As with Walker and Easton, civic virtue is racialized, but against the backdrop of Delaney's analysis, it points beyond the shores of the United States. Immigration turns out not to be an affront to republicanism, but an outgrowth of its logic. Okay, so we've traveled a long way, yes? We got a little ways to go. You all good? You stay with me, okay? Got a little ways to go. So I've spent a great deal of time talking about civic virtue, how it is transformed by African Americans into a defense of solidarity, and some of the differences among them on this regarding the intensity of their defense of solidarity, racial solidarity. I now turn to this second issue of freedom that is central to the Republican discourse. And to do this, there's no other way for me to do this, but to do this, we have to look at this contemporary figure, contemporary defender of republicanism, Philip Pettit. Because I think he has provided a masterful interpretation of this tradition. And I want to look at him because I think when placed against the backdrop of the condition of early black life, it proves inadequate as a historical description, owing largely to his emphasis on political institutions and his failure to address the the culture of political society. Now, republicanism need not be displaced, but it is in need of theoretical supplementation to properly align freedom as non-domination with the conditions that black people find themselves in. And if you follow me on this, this will involve a very important and significant move. It will involve disconnecting the idea of domination from its primary indicator, a master or dominus, some identifiable agent, and connecting domination to culture as such. Pettit can only has in view an actual agent and seems unable to track culture. So in various writings, Pettit defends a variant of republicanism that draws from Greek and Roman sources. And this version, defined largely by its concern with freedom, he focuses mostly on that second strand, argues that people could enjoy liberty both in relation to one another and to the collectivity only by being invested with the power and status of a citizen. Well, what does it mean to be a citizen? Well, citizenship comes with a distinct kind of power, a power to hold at bay those that would have you under their arbitrary power. In the absence of said power, one is in a condition of domination. So to be dominated, Pettit tells us, involves a relationship in which one person has the capacity to interfere. They have the capacity to interfere on an arbitrary basis. They have a capacity to interfere on an arbitrary basis in certain choices that the other is in a position to make. What is significant here is that the dominating party need not use their power. They need only have the capacity to deploy it if they so choose. This is really what it means to be at the arbitrary mercy of another. You just really never know when the power is going to show itself. As Cicero puts it, a figure from whom Pettit draws intellectual energy, quote, freedom which is not a matter of having a just master, but of having none at all, end quote. To be a slave is to be at the arbitrary mercy of a master, even if the master is of a benevolent kind, even if it's a good master. Republicanism counters the danger of domination by specifying three of its defining elements. Well, the first is the very idea of freedom itself, that to be free is not to be under or at the arbitrary mercy of another. But how do you realize and protect that freedom? Well, you need a body of laws that will track your interests and concerns as citizens. And you need an institutional structure, a constitutional structure, that creates a set of barriers to the use of arbitrary power. And if there's any doubt about whether or not the government is acting in a way that protects your freedom, you also need a space to contest that power, to point it out, and to say, no, you got to change this. Now, this is a very brief sketch of Pettit's argument, and who would deny that domination so understood threatens freedom? I mean, James Pennington, for example, is very clear at the outset of his 1849 autobiography, The Fugitive Blacksmith, that there is no such thing as a kind master or a Christian master, insofar as the chattel principle is active. One is unfree. And what is the chattel principle for Pennington? Well, it is living at the arbitrary mercy of another. But it is not clear that Pettit's specific rendering of domination or the response to it effectively addresses the concerns of African Americans, nor do I think this is peculiar to Pettit's interpretation of the tradition. And the reason is that the different accounts of slavery to which republicanism is a response, namely political slavery and chattel slavery, there are different ideas of slavery at the heart of republicanism. And the responses to those different ideas of slavery partly depends on what account of slavery you have in view. So recall that on Pettit's account, freedom is always explained as an opposition between citizenship and slavery. The historical presumption, and this was at work in figures like Aristotle or James Harrington, as well as the American framers, was that a status that one enjoyed was now being denied or was in doubt. In Aristotle, for example, political slavery derived its meaning from an opposition between those for whom it would represent a demeaning, traumatic loss and those for whom it was supposed to be natural. This idea continued well into 17th century England under monarchical rule. While it was true that the English monarch was supreme over his subjects, it did not follow that the monarchy could do as he pleased with his subjects. By the time of the American Revolution, the idea was not that the colonists were seeking rights they did not have, but that they were seeking to reclaim their rightful status as British subjects. So, for example, in 1774, Thomas Jefferson criticizes, quote, the wanton exercise of the king's power against the rights of British America. And the refusal by the king to respond appropriately led the colonists to refer to him accordingly in the Declaration of Independence. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which defines a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. But let's not lose the point here. The idea was that monarchy and the idea of a free people could fit seamlessly together, and the king had now acted illegitimately, thus making him a tyrant or a master. From Aristotle to the British monarchy to the American founders, political slavery involved a denial to those of their rightful standing. A dominating figure for them was one that acted against standing laws and customs or outside the boundaries of constitutional norms. Addressing this situation merely involved proper alignment with standing laws and customs or ensuring the proper functioning of a constitutional order, even if that meant declaring independence. Hence, Jefferson in 1775, even in 1775, longed for a restoration of our just rights. Pettit's republicanism develops out of this thread of thinking. And this explains why freedom as non-domination is realized for him through the proper establishment of positive laws and a constitutional order that removes the threat of tyranny. But what if the problem is not about the denial of a status that you previously enjoyed? What if the problem is related to the belief that you never had standing to begin with and weren't worthy of standing to begin with? If the latter is the case, as I have already argued, I hope, then Pettit's configuration of republicanism will prove inadequate. Indeed, much of the tradition that focuses on political slavery will not be able to speak to the depth of the problem that is captured by chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is of a different kind because it is tied to normative claims about white supremacy and superiority and the natural subordination of black people. It cannot therefore be effectively addressed by the response provided to political slavery. Now, in understanding this distinction between political slavery and chattel slavery, we now have to focus less on the figure of the master or the dominus that connects chattel slavery and political slavery, and more on the idea that in the case of political slavery, one's status as a slave, as the British colonists argue, the American British colonists, is a violation of one's standing. And in the second case, chattel slavery, one's status as a slave is perceived to be natural. One cannot reclaim a status in a community that one never had. And it is that idea that prompted Delaney, as you will recall, to argue for immigration. It is this second configuration that extends well beyond the figure of the master into the domain of culture itself, into our habits and our sensibilities and our ways of relating to each other. This is what Douglass has in mind in his 1848 address when he says of nominally free blacks, in northern states, we are not slaves to individuals, not personal slaves, yet in many respects we are the slaves of the community. Well, if you think that what you have to have in mind to understand slavery is the one who can own the slave, an identifiable agent, then you're going to find it very difficult to make sense of this idea of slave of the community. But what does this really mean? Well, consider a passage that I shared with you earlier from David Walker. If any of you wish to know how free you are, let one of you start and go through the southern and western states of this country, and unless you have your free papers, they will sell you into eternal slavery. Well, we know now that part of what Walker is doing is trying to capture the way race functions. It has internal content that functions as a universal category, and in functioning as a universal category, it eclipses your individual subjectivity. But something more is at work here. As Josiah Easton explains, the meaning of racial designation in the 19th century is an auxiliary to slavery and legal codes of exclusion. It follows, and this is Easton, it follows its victims into every avenue of life. Today, we refer to this as racial stigma because it shapes the kind of social epistemic context as well as the judgments we make about our fellows. The negative connotations associated with African Americans, Easton argues, are located in public sentiment and biases the observing agent. The auxiliary to slavery, these negative connotations, he explains, and listen to this, is capable of accommodating itself to local circumstances and conditions and appearing with all the nature of the old beast slavery. And the point here is that the demeaning qualities attached to blacks can persist through institutional transformation and as such can retain residual ideas of the presumed superiority of whites and presumed inferiority of blacks. Hence, chattel slavery, the formal practice of it, can disappear, and yet its underlying meaning can continue to cast a long shadow that leaves the civic and ethical existence of black Americans precarious. I mean, Easton is describing the logic of what we would call white supremacy today, that lives beyond any specific institutional instantiation and expresses itself in what Easton, during the period, and a great many others, called prejudice. And this explains why, in the 19th century, blacks traveling in specific states had to carry free papers. Traveling with free papers was meant to exempt you legally from what was otherwise a natural and normal condition of enslavement. As Easton's argument implies, this social epistemic context renders the status of black Americans, the lives they lead, and the activities they undertake uncertain, subject to domination at best and at worst, death. Given the workings of prejudice, Easton places less weight on the legal response to slavery and more on the need for a cultural transformation. And here now, I think, is our last passage for the evening. This is how Easton frames it. The system of slavery, in its effects, is imposed on the injured party in two forms, or by two methods. The first method is by code of laws originated in public sentiment, as enslaved states. The other is prejudice, originating in the same public sentiment as it exists in free states. The first method assumes the form of law and therefore is not capable of inflicting such deep injuries as when it exists without law. Huh? How's that possible? Slavery is quite a horrible institution. Well, Easton is not claiming that chattel slavery doesn't cause deep harms on those against which it is inflicted. For him, in the context of chattel slavery, what he wants you to see is that prejudice is displaced from public sentiment to codes of law. The law does most of the work, he wants to say. The law bears the weight of prejudice. But in the absence of codes of law, the distinction between blacks and whites, between the inferiority of the one and the supposed superiority of the other, must be sustained by something else, and the something else becomes public sentiment as such. It must, in other words, find its daily support in the habits and sensibilities and conduct and practices of white Americans that police the boundaries between them and their black counterparts. Now, Easton directs his reader to the cultural status of blacks as subordinates that is the foundation upon which codified laws and institutions rest. And addressing this problem, he wants you to see, is not merely about attending to the existing political juridical framework. Rather, one must seek to disrupt the cultural force of prejudice that disciplines both blacks and whites. And from the perspective of the 19th century, these thinkers advanced their argument about the logic of white supremacy and the persistence of prejudice to make a more pointed claim to their black counterparts. Those that take themselves to be free, let's say in the 19th century in the North, in comparison to those in the South, are profoundly confused. And the reason is simple. To the extent that you cannot travel freely across all the states, freedom experienced in any one of the states is merely an illusion. But notice what is going on here. This is not merely about laws on the books. Walker, Easton, and even Delaney take seriously the practice of slavery, but they also take seriously the memory of servitude and the ongoing life of stigma. And this is why blacks in the North can also be slaves of the community. More importantly, freedom turns out to be ephemeral, a temporary break from reality that leaves African Americans' liberty without cultural support. And in lacking such support, freedom can't remain resilient, and for that reason it can hardly be called freedom at all. But the response to this, if you confine your analysis to law or to legality, will obscure the deeper sense of standing. I think finally, from the sort of dark past of the 19th century, we can hear, I think, a more compelling set of reflections that speak to us today. If I think about the United States for a moment, if you join me in thinking about the United States for a moment, to extend political rights to African Americans, as was the case in the 1960s, although important, will do little more than conceal the problem. For the issue is not that they are denied standing they otherwise had in the political community, but that they were never thought fit to have standing at all, an idea that continues to shape the outlook of many Americans. To address this requires one to hold in view the lower position of worth blacks occupy on the scale of value that animates American life and continues to haunt the present moment. And by attending to the cultural logic of domination, it is precisely this issue that African American thinkers sought to bring into view. Theirs was a reminder that freedom, both then and now, demands more than what reliance on law, reliance on constitutionalism can provide. Thank you.